Gene Aenchbacher, Larry Kiley.
How do you do?
It's my pleasure to meet you.
Glad to know you.
Gene, we've talked a little bit before we got on the camera here, and you were telling me quite a varied history of your military past. You retired from the military, that's correct?
Yes, I retired February 1970.
And you were what rank?
Well, I was a colonel at that time.
Colonel when you retired. When were you born?
September 2nd, 1920. A long time ago.
Where at?
Atlanta, Georgia.
Atlanta, Georgia. And I think as we go through this, we're going to find out how you found your way to Pratt. So we'll go on here a little bit with that. Where'd you go to high school?
Well, I went to Boys High School in Atlanta, and right after that, graduated. I went to Georgia Tech for a couple of years. Meanwhile, I was interested in aviation, wanted to learn to fly, and the Air Force seemed to be the easiest way to get there. So the Air Force had a program, or the Army Air Corps at that time, had a program. You could become a flying cadet, earn a commission with 2 years of college. And so I enlisted in 26 April 1941 at Fort McPherson, Atlanta, Georgia.
Atlanta, Georgia. What'd you learn to fly in?
Well, my flying training was primarily in Texas, Hicks Field at Fort Worth, and then San Angelo, Texas, Goodfellow Field it's called, and then Brooks Field in San Antonio. I was commissioned there December 12th, 1941.
And I was stationed in 6584 Security Police Squadron at Brooks Air Force Base.
Oh, you were?
Yes.
Well, that's a coincidence. Well, it was one of the old bases. The last time I visited, they still have the balloon hangar there.
Yeah, and they have a wonderful museum there. Have you been back to
Yes,
the museum?
we went into the museum, and I sent them a copy of our, I sent them our graduation class picture, which they have reproduced, and I was able to fill in a lot of blanks of people that had been there at the same time. Our class was split up quite a bit. Of course, this was right after Pearl Harbor, and so it scattered to the four winds, but I did know where a lot of them ended up, so it was interesting to see that they still had some records of where everybody went.
Yeah, that's quite a base down there. See, when I was there, and I left there in '95, I was in the reserves, and I was assigned to the regular Air Force. But it was more like a country club than it was an Air Force base because there were no planes there.
Yeah.
A lot of history at Brooks.
Yes,
a lot of history.
I think Lindbergh graduated from
Yes,
Brooks.
yes.
I ran into one of those coincidences that you run into. I was on an airplane going from Algiers back to Rabat for a little R&R, and it was on this C-47, and there was a man in civilian clothes sitting across the aisle from him. We were the only two people in the airplane, and I kept saying, I know this man from somewhere. So finally I leaned over and I said, I believe I ought to know you. I introduced myself. I was a captain then. I said, I'm Captain Aenchbacher. And he said, well, I'm Colonel Charles Lindbergh. You can imagine the embarrassment. I said, yes, well, you probably one of the guys that helped me get into the service. Everybody in those days, Lindbergh was a hero for all the young men.
You went to Georgia Tech, and you received 2 years of college there, and then you went into flying training, and then you were in the reserve program.
Well, right after the war, I went from active duty into reserve duty, and then the Air Force had a program at that time where you could finish your college degree. So I went back to University of North Carolina and finished my degree. In between, I married Lyda Beth Fincham from Pratt, and we've traveled quite a few places since that time. But Then when we finished it at North Carolina, we were stationed at MacDill Field, Florida, and while there, I had an opportunity to go to Alaska and do a training film called Arctic Geography. Many people in the service had not flown in the Arctic at all, and so this General LeMay, who was running Strategic Air Command at that time, wanted some training films made on Arctic operations. It was about a series of about 6, as I recall. We had the initial one, which was called Arctic Geography, and we flew from the end of the Aleutian chain halfway to Greenland, and we had another airplane in Greenland coming back this way. And then later on, they made some films like maintenance and navigation and that sort of thing. But later on, of course, in Strategic Air Command, the shortest way to Russia was over the top, so you needed to know something about the Arctic.
When you were in the Air Force, the Army Air Force or Army Air Corps.
Yeah, it was called the Army Air Corps at the beginning.
The Army Air Corps. And you were assigned, where were you assigned after flying training? You went to, what kind of aircraft you go to?
Well, immediately went to, I stayed there at Brooks for, as I recall, 4 or 5 weeks flying an observation. The Army had an observation school to train its people to observe what's going on, and we flew them around. But then in February of '42, I was assigned to MacDill Field at Tampa, Florida, in B-17s. Then at this time, that was when Paul Tibbets, who dropped the A-bomb, was my first squadron commander. But we trained for a month or so at MacDill, and then opened up a base at Sarasota. And then in late May, middle of June, as I recall exactly, we headed to England. We went the northern route up through Labrador, Greenland, Iceland, down to Scotland, and then down to England. And we were there in England, and our unit ran the first heavy bombardment mission against Europe. General Tibbets now, he led the mission, and our wing ran about, our group ran about, as I recall, some debate about a dual target thing, but 14 missions, I think. At that time, of course, the Russians were pressing for the second front, and so the powers that be had decided that perhaps one way to relieve the situation somewhat would be to invade North Africa. So in November, we went down to the 2 B-17 units that were there in England, went down to North Africa, and I finished up my missions there and was back in the States June of '43. A year overseas. I ran 47 missions and didn't get wounded at all, and did have a couple of 3 crew members were wounded by flak, but basically they were not seriously wounded. And anyway, I came back to the States and was assigned to Dalhart, Texas as a B-17 instructor. And that was in July of '43, and as the European war began to wind down somewhat, the air war anyway, the B-29 and the Pacific thing was coming into picture. So most of us, at least I was for sure, transferred to Pratt to start the B-29 program. And we had to transition and learn to fly the B-29. Many of the people that had been in England and many in the Pacific too, as far as that goes, flying B-17s. So came to Pratt in April of '44, and was here until November then of '45. And one of the interesting things that happened here in Pratt, insofar as the training program was concerned, was that the weather's kind of bad for training, so the 2nd Air Force, which was our controlling headquarters, decided to form a thing called the Gypsy Task Force, and they sent all the units in Kansas and Nebraska, B-29 units, were transferred throughout the Caribbean. Some were at Batista Field in Havana, Cuba. It so happened that the Pratt unit was at Puerto Rico, and so we had a winter vacation, so to speak, in Puerto Rico. And when we left, of course, it was dark and gray, and when we came back, the wheat had come, it was green country again when we came back in early spring. But it was interesting flying there. Of course, the weather was perfect for flying in the Caribbean.
But did Colonel Tibbets at the time, did he come back to Pratt in that period of time?
Tibbets left our unit and went to the headquarters in North Africa. Then the story goes that General Arnold, well, they were developing the atomic bomb at that time, and General Arnold had sent word that he wanted the most experienced combat operations pilot available, and Tibbets was selected as that man. And he came back, and they went out to Wendover, Utah, and did their training out there. But that was, he had gone up to the headquarters some few months before he was, of course, brought back here. And the people that he had, the crew he had flown with, they stayed there in the squadron. And as a matter of fact, I've flown missions, substitute, you know, when somebody's sick, like Tom Farabee, the bombardier on the Enola Gay was in our squadron and flew several missions with my crew. And Van Kirk, the navigator, I can't recall exactly, but we were all together, and we'd been together since back in February of 42. So Tom Farabee passed away now. I think it was last year he's passed away, but Van Kirk, the navigator, is still around, and I see them about every 2 years. We have a B-17 unit reunion every couple of years, and tell our war stories over again.
Well, sometimes it's, I think it's kind of good to relive those stories, you know, that I really do.
Well, obviously it was an impressionable time in our lives, and the adventure, if nothing else, and obviously we lost people, and I think out of our original 12 crews, only 7 came back. And so the losses were there. You look at the history of the 8th Air Force. We went down and became the 12th, and then later the 15th Air Force. They were attacking Germany from the south, and the 8th Air Force from the west. Those missions against places like Schweinfurt, when you lose 60 airplanes, that's 600 people. It was tough sledding,
Colonel Bob Morgan's going to be here Friday.
Yes.
And did you know Colonel Morgan?
Well, I knew him, shall I say, casually here at Pratt. He had had a squadron at that time, and I had a training squadron of instructor people, and we worked more directly with his operations officer, John Carroll. And I've got to talk to Bob when I see him about whatever happened to John, because I've never heard. But he was the man that we worked with primarily. Morgan had other responsibilities besides just the training of the crews. He had to run the squadron and administration and that sort of thing. And so we would talk, casually here and there.
What training unit was you with at Pratt?
Pardon?
What training unit were you with at Pratt?
Well, I think it was the 246th. I'd have to look at my records to remember the exact number, but I know the man that was base commander here most of the time was Colonel Kermit D. Stevens, whom I had met briefly in England before we went down to North Africa. We had, to digress just a moment, when General Eisenhower and his staff was going down, his headquarters was first set up on the Rock of Gibraltar, or in the Rock of Gibraltar is probably a better way to put it. They had selected, Tibbets was flying General Eisenhower, and he had selected 6 crews out of our squadron to take the staff down. So after we went down to a base at Bournemouth, England, on the south coast of England, and it was raining there for 3 days, as I recall. And finally, General Eisenhower told Tibbets that I've got to go. The war's going to begin. I can't be sitting here in England, and the war's going on down there. So we took off and flew right over the rooftops because it was still bad weather. One of the airplanes didn't get off and came down the next day. General Doolittle happened to be on that airplane, and it was attacked by a German patrol bomber, and the co-pilot was wounded. I can't remember how he was killed or not, but on my particular airplane, I had I remember an American admiral, and also had I'll think of his name here in a second. He was Eisenhower's photographic, Darrell Zanuck, and he was on Eisenhower's staff as a lieutenant colonel, as his photographer.
Same Darrell Zanuck as I'm thinking about?
Yeah, Darrell Zanuck, the movie guy. And it was interesting. He got on the airplane, and we had taken the bomb shackles out of one side and had made a sort of a platform thing in the bomb bay to carry the luggage, because we had to take 10 people, and everybody brought a couple of B4 bags and a foot locker, So anyway, we were prepared for that, but the bags were stacked up in the bomb bay, and Zanuck got on and he said, "Lieutenant, where's the best place to sleep on this airplane?" And I thought we'd had 3 days sitting there in the rain. He should have had plenty of time to sleep. But anyway, I said the best place would be to climb up on top of the B4 bags in the bomb bay, which he did. And as we had to skirt out around France, of course, and staying at low level. And we got down where the weather began to clear up, down off the coast of Portugal. And he came up awake and came up to the cockpit and said, "What's that over there?" And I said, "That's Portugal." And he said, "Well, I've had a nice nap." But anyway, then shortly thereafter, there was another trip. General Eisenhower had to go out and to Algiers. There was obviously a lot of political discussion about which way the French were going to fight, whether us or the Germans, and then the French internal politics was also a problem. So anyway, he had to go out, and the squadron was getting ready to go out to Algiers to start bombing. This is right after the invasion had started, and we were, of course, the Germans had begun to resupply into Tunis, and also, of course, the British Eighth Army was pushing against Rommel, trying to push him out of North Africa, and we were squeezing him. But anyway, the squadron was going, so I had cranked up the engines, and all of a sudden I got this tap on my shoulder. More than just a gentle tap, it was a sort of a slap. And I looked around, and here's General Doolittle. And he said, "Where in the hell are you going?" And I said, "I'm going with our squadron, sir, out to Algiers." He said, "The hell you are, shut the engines down. You're going to take General Eisenhower and bring him back." "Yes, sir." Cut the engines down. And pretty soon, General Eisenhower came on, and I just presumed that I'd put him in the nicest seat we had, which was the radio operator seat, which had a little desk and a sort of a chair type arrangement. And he said, "No, Lieutenant," he said, "I don't want there." He said, Admiral Cunningham, who was a Britisher and his naval guy, he said, "Admiral Cunningham wants to show me the invasion fleet," which the British ships were all moored out around the Rock of Gibraltar. And so, how's the best way to do this? So I told him, bring him up. And as soon as we took off, we let him get in the co-pilot seat, and then this admiral stood between us, and we circled around the rock. And this admiral, he knew every ship by sight. He could look down and name the ship, and he could name the captain of the ship. And I kept saying, "My, that admiral, you know, he probably picked the captains in the first place, but he knew." And then he said, and we would sort of head into toward the fleet, and he'd say, "Lieutenant, veer away." He says, "My gunner's a little bit trigger happy." So we stayed away, and but we went on out to Algiers, and then coming back, we ran into some bad weather, and of course at this time Gibraltar was blacked out. There were no lights because there were German submarines around. Spain being neutral, it was all lit up just like normal. But as we came back, the weather got worse and worse, and we couldn't get radio contact. But we knew that if we stayed just off the coast of Spain, we would end up in Gibraltar. And you could see the surf crashing over there, and plus the rain, the wind. Pretty soon we did get in touch, and they gave us a steer, as they said. And so we came on in, and we saw a row of lights, which we assumed was the runway lights. But as we approached and started to land, we figured out that wasn't the runway lights. That was the lights along the road in Spain, which just parallels the runway. And so we had to go around the rock. The rock is, I recall, 1,398 feet, and it goes just about straight up. And it's solid rock, too, so you don't want to hit it. And so we went around the second time. Again, they had not turned on the landing lights, the runway lights. And we were a little low, so we had to go around again. And we went in on the third time and landed okay. And it was still raining, and we were standing on the wing, and his staff was livid. They were worried about the general, this, that, and the other, which you would expect that, of course. And so they found an easy target to chew on me. "Why didn't you do this?" And Eisenhower said, leave the lieutenant alone. I told him to come ahead. So that stopped a lot of the conversation. But he wrote me a nice letter the next day, which is one of my mementos that I treasure. I've talked to the Eisenhower Museum. They'd like to have the original, but I don't know I haven't decided exactly what to do with it yet.
That your mementos you talking about, is that one of those in that portfolio you brought in?
Yes, I brought a copy out for the
museum?
For the museum, if I'm not sure exactly what the scope of the Pratt Memorial Museum is, whether it's all of World War II or whether it's purely B-29, but I've talked with them, and anything, I have pictures like of Tibbetts in the early days, and things that would fit in somewhat to this thing with Morgan that you're having here now.
Well, I think, you know, the things that you brought, the mementos, that's exactly what the All Veterans Memorial is all about. It's just all veterans, all genre of military, and whatever we can gather for the museum. The more we have, like any museum, the more you have, the better. So I'm sure that we're going to be happy with anything that you can give to us. Let's go. I'm going to digress on you a little bit now. You were stationed at Pratt, and you flew B-29s at Pratt, and you were in a training squadron. Something else happened to you at Pratt.
Well, probably the most significant thing was this. I met a young lady here. She happened to be visiting the base, and we, quote, ran into each other. And we were married in December 1945. And immediately, that's when we went back to school. So we went to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and our first son was born there. And then after I finished up at North Carolina, we were then transferred down to Tampa, Florida, which was my first basic assignment out of flying school. But anyway, we stayed there. And again, here she was, a young wife and a young baby, and I had to go on this training film assignment to Alaska, which is typical in the Air Force. It seems that, especially in Strategic Air Command, and we see it today, even in the military. The fact that there's family separation is a tough thing, especially when you're with a brand new baby. And our son, who incidentally has retired as an Air Force colonel just 2 years ago now, he graduated from KU in 1970, which was the same year I retired. But I came back to KU and pinned his second lieutenant bars on him.
That's
and
great.
And then 30 years later, he retired down at San Antonio. So we went down for his retirement there. And he was the hospital administrator for Wilford Hall, which is the Air Force's biggest hospital. It's like Walter Reed and whatnot. But and he now works in Dallas for a man by the name of Cooper Institute. He's the sort of founder of the aerobics exercise type of thing.
What was this young lady's name that you met in Pratt?
Didn't I mention Lyda Beth Fincham? I thought I said Lyda Beth Fincham.
I knew we had to get that in there somewhere. I think you did earlier, but I wanted it there.
Well, yeah, be sure we do.
Yes, we're not going to leave that one out. I guarantee you that we're not going to. I spent, I'm going to just give you a little brief. I spent 22 years in the military, reserve and active. So I still have a habit of calling colonels, although retired, still colonel. So if I do that, just bear with me, because I do.
Well, that's all right. You know, we joke about doctors are always doctors. Colonels and generals are always colonels and generals.
Well, when I worked here at the junior college for Dr. Wojciechowski, he's a retired colonel in the Air Force, and I still call him about half the time colonel. So, how are we progressing here through your history? Pretty well.
To skim through, to skim a little bit, from the 16th Photo Squadron, where I was doing the training films, we were transferred first to Topeka, and were there just a short while, not more than 6 months, and then we were transferred to headquarters SAC. General LeMay had taken over SAC and had just moved out to Omaha. So I was assigned there for 2 years, then away to a military school for 6 months down in Alabama, and back into Omaha to Offutt. And so I had 5 years at headquarters SAC, and very interesting working with General LeMay and also the other generals that you served under there. Then I'd had quite a bit of staff time, and I felt career-wise I ought to get somewhat back into the operational business. So I got an assignment to command a B-29 squadron out on Okinawa, and went out there, saw the tail end of the Korean War, scheduled to be out there for 6 months since it was temporary duty without your family. But the peace process took a little longer, and it stretched from 6 months to 11 months, which was, again, a tough family problem, because here was Betty there at home with 2 children. We were living in a small town right outside the base up in Omaha. And but anyway, we came back, and I had hoped to go to go back to Florida, to MacDill. I always liked Tampa, but anyway, the unit that I had joined out on Okinawa was scheduled to go back to Tampa, but as things happened, plans changed, and they sent me back to Lincoln, Nebraska, just 60 miles down the road from Omaha. So we came here to Wichita and transitioned from the B-29 into B-47. And then we were there in Lincoln for 3 years. I had a tactical squadron, then I had a maintenance squadron, then I was director of operations for the wing, and then I had an opportunity to go to Norway in NATO assignment, and I had never had the opportunity to have my family with me overseas. So this was a good opportunity, and we took it and had a very delightful tour. Norway's a nice, clean country, and we got to travel in Europe, and it was a nice assignment.
I have to ask you one question here. You were in Europe in B-17s, and there was another. You already talked about one movie type person, and that was Daryl Zenny. And I have to ask you this one: did you ever run into or meet up with what later became General James Stewart?
No, I didn't. Never did meet him. We did have early on Gene Raymond, who was the husband of Jeanette MacDonald, and he was our intelligence officer in England. And but he didn't. When we left England to go to North Africa, he didn't go with us. I did in Norway, though, just before we actually went to Norway. Our operations officer, a fellow by the name of Bob Christie, had been in Sonia Henney's ice skating troupe back when she first came to America to make movies. And anyway, he and his wife had maintained, his wife was her companion for a long while. They had maintained contact. So while we were on rotation, which was a 3 months deal where you go over someplace and without your family, of course, we were in England on rotation, and we had to put an airplane on static display in Oslo, Norway. So Bob Christie, our operations officer, decided he'd find out if Sonia Haney was in Oslo, which she was, and he'd call back and ask his wife back in Lincoln. So then he asked me if I wanted to go to Oslo. Well, I'd never been to Norway. Yeah, let's go. And he said, and we're going to have a dinner with Sonia Haney. So, it was quite interesting. At that time, Sonia Haney's husband, who was a Swede, he had 6 ships tied up in the Suez Canal. It was one of those deals back in those days between closing the canal and whatever. But he was not very happy with General Eisenhower, I believe, was president at that time, for the side that he took and had his ship stranded there in the canal. But that's the only, those two, I guess, would be the only two, quote, movie people that well, we did have on these training films, the company that did the professional side. We flew the airplane, and they had geographers taking pictures of what they wanted to show about Arctic geography. But the movie company was the same company that made the Lone Ranger movies.
Oh, yeah.
And it was interesting to talk to these people behind the scenes. They weren't actors. They were might say, the mechanical side of making movies. And it was very interesting to talk with them about how they would. We had to go out to the Arctic Survival School at Nome, Alaska, and part of the deal was to make an igloo, and we had the igloo. They had Eskimo instructors showing us the different styles of igloos that you can make, and everything from just draping a parachute over top of some blocks of ice or whatever. But these Hollywood people, a couple of them, I don't think had ever been off cement in their life, but they decided just to make a little igloo under like a pup tent. It so happened that the wind came up and blew their pup tent away, and here they are lying out there on the Arctic ice, trying to, and there were no lights around, and they're wandering around, and they wandered into our big igloo too. So anyway, you run into that kind of experience with them.
So where did you finally wind up?
Well,
during I'm looking here. You were C-130 wing commander.
Well, after Norway, I came back, and I was in the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon for 3 years, and this was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I suppose the most significant thing was that we had to brief President Kennedy on. He had, of course, just come in, and had to be briefed on the atomic war plan, and I was in the strategic section of operations. So my boss, who was a General Hardin, he did the briefing itself. Of course, we all worked to put together this thing, and went over to the White House, and they had the President, of course, and then the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and it was quite a interesting and revealing meeting, because Kennedy, brand new, and you just didn't, atomic secrets weren't floating around for the public to know about, and so he had a lot of interesting questions, and Mr. McNamara too, and but anyway, it was a significant thing to see people of that caliber functioning in a meeting like that. And, but then right after that, so after the 3 years there, I went down to Langley Field and was a vice commander of a C-130 wing for a couple of 3 months, and then I got command of the wing, and then that was like in late 64. Well, November 65, we were told to deploy to the Philippines, and so we went to the Philippines. Headquarters was on an island called Mactan, which has recently been in the public news because it's the base that the rescue people have been operating, trying to find that helicopter that was carrying people in for these missionaries that are the terrorists down there have captured. But we had 2 squadrons there. I had 2 squadrons at Clark Field, and then we also had to keep 25 airplanes operating in Vietnam. The reason we were outside was that this was early on in the Vietnam thing, and there wasn't runway room for all the units that they wanted to put. So they left the airlift units out on the fringe and flew in and stayed, and then came back out for a period of time. Later on, when they got the big bases built, then there was room to put the airlift units in there. But I came back from there. That was a year's tour, another unaccompanied tour. Came back from there, and then we were back to Langley Field. And another one, when we were deployed out to Mactan, of course, the family had to move off the base. The only time we'd ever lived on a base in all of our career was at Langley. So we had to move off the base, had to go out and buy a house, and we weren't, and then we didn't know, of course, when you deploy like that, you never quite know where you're going to return to. Anyway, I did get assigned back there, so we were able to move back on. Then at that time, too, our daughter was in a senior in high school, and she wanted, of course, to have all of her friends in high school, wanted to graduate from high school there. So anyway, we stayed until my retirement in 1970.
How many children did you have?
Had 3. I have a son, daughter, and another son. And the daughter was born up in Lincoln, and so was the son. So, we got a lot of Nebraska.
Do you have a lot of Nebraska red at your house during a football season?
Well, we tend to root either for Georgia Tech or KU.
The Ramblin' Wreck from Georgia Tech, and I think you had an airplane with that name, didn't you?
Yeah. The University of North Carolina doesn't seem to put out football. They're usually our enemy in basketball, so we have a little divided loyalty.
Yeah.
If KU's playing University of North Carolina.
Well, you retired in February 1970.
Yes.
And you make where your home?
Well, we live in Wichita now, and of course we have family out here, and so we keep contact, and it's very interesting because my family moved around from Atlanta up and down the East Coast, and so I've lost my mother and father, both passed away. So has, of course, Betty's. But the kids, because we were stationed this way so much, I say this way in Midwest, the children have a closer relationship with our Pratt relatives than they do mine. But we get to visit mine every year or so. If we go down Florida way, we will stop in and see them. But it's here because of they sort of grew up with them more than they did on my side. So anyway, we keep close relations and have for a long time. We have many friends here in Pratt, Medicine Lodge, and so it's always nice to be out here. And I was just talking to Macaulay about helping in whatever way I can in this museum, and we see a lot of them when we go to military reunions. We just came back from one in Fort Worth for our B-47 unit up in Nebraska and Lincoln, and then we're getting ready to go next year probably to our B-17 reunion. And so anyway, we get to see the museums, and they're very meaningful. One of the things that I mentioned to Macaulay earlier was that we now see the sons and daughters of the men in the unit coming to the reunions. Not a whole lot, but enough to make it a new factor. And in many cases, coming and they're asking questions. They want to know what was their dad like, type of thing. We find that many veterans don't want to talk about their military experience, and so they don't tell quote any stories. But it's one of those things that happens. Some guys do and some don't. But we've had in the last several reunions widows and children coming and saying, "Tell me something about my dad."
That's the guys that didn't come back.
Yeah.
And I think that's phenomenal.
Yes, it's
That's wonderful.
My co-pilot's daughter was working at the Fitzsimmons Hospital, military veterans hospital out in Denver. And this has been several years ago now. But anyway, she wrote me a letter and she said, "I can't get Dad to talk about anything." And she said, "Give me some questions that he can't just say yes or no to." So I sat down and wrote her out a series of questions that would require him to explain why such and such and what such and such happened. And she wrote back and she says, "This has opened him up considerably," and he's a little bit older than I am now. But anyway, it's one of those phenomenons that people, and you're thinking about military veterans, that it's just one of those aspects that is a new angle to this whole business.
Well, we think we're going to have a good museum here, and we don't think so. We know so, and it's people like you that are going to make it a great museum, really, Gene. And I'll tell you what, I can't say enough, and I can't thank you enough for what you fellows did and women did during World War II. I said, and I talked to you folks, and I wonder how in the world a human being can go through the stuff that you did. I've seen many training films after being in the service 22 years myself, and I said, and I wonder in awe, how do you get through that? Could I get through that? And you guys did. You lived that, which is amazing.
Well, I think I've listened to a video of Bob Morgan. Picked it up just by chance. But he talks about somewhat along the line. The thing that, one of the comments he made and pursued a little bit was the comradeship that you develop in a crew. And I think that's one of the things that most military people have learned. Very few people do it by themselves. And if you 10 men, counting yourself, you should know how each of those is, and you should learn. It was not nobody's the same. commander's responsibility to pick the best element he can out of that guy and say, okay, we'll use that part of him because mission, for example, the pilot's up there in front flying the airplane trying to stay in formation. The tail gunner is back there. He's back there, he's looking for the German airplane or whatever kind it happens to be. He's fighting an entirely different war. You come back from a mission and you sit down and talk to the guy, you don't think you went on the same mission because each guy taking care of what he's responsible for is concentrating on that. He doesn't know what you're doing, as long as he does his job. And so I think most military people learn that sooner or later. If they don't, it's they probably don't end up in the command setup. That the utilization of people and the way you treat them is one of the key things in command. It's not always the bluster and the whatever. I can remember an occasion. Well, for instance, you're going to have General Tibbetts out here. When Tibbetts we were learning to fly the B-17. We had a brand new runway to go down to Sarasota, Florida, put an asphalt top on Florida sand. Anyway, I came in one day and landed with the ball turret guns. Gets into the turret, and then he can swivel it around. But then when he gets out, he's supposed to crank that thing up so that the guns are parallel with the fuselage. Well, this time it didn't happen. And so, without ever touching the brakes, the airplane began to slow down. I didn't know I had 250 caliber tail skids plowing up all this asphalt, and I see this ring out the side, and oh my gosh. So the airplane finally came to a stop without me touching the brakes. The tower's telling all the airplanes, we only had one runway, to circle and whatever, we get this settled down here. And so I'm outside the airplane, brand new second lieutenant, and here comes Captain Tibbetts, my squadron commander. Well, I could see myself losing my crew, be a co-pilot instead of a first pilot. And I'm standing there in a brace just waiting to get chewed out. And Tibbetts walked up and he looked at the guns and then looked at me and he said, well, Aenchbacher, at least you were using the damn thing, and got back in his Jeep and left. Now, I tell him this when I see him. We don't talk about it very much, but I said, you apparently knew I was already mortified, and there wasn't anything you could say to me that would make it any worse. And he said, yeah. He said, what good would it do me to chew you out? You've learned? And I, no. And there are some people who would, come in and start just, low rating some guy, you dumb so-and-so, and this, that, and the other. Why didn't you do this? Well, that's a lesson that I've taken with me ever since then.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things you learn. You just, no use piling on.
Don't land with your 50 calibers.
Yeah, you might want to use them.
Are we off there, Clay? Yeah, just that one on the end. How much time we got left?
I can't get it to pause.
No. Just flick it off there in the back. It'll pick itself back up. Well, Gene, I said earlier, I thank you guys for everything you did, and I definitely thank you for coming over and sharing this hour with us, because that's what we've been doing. It seems like about 2 minutes.
Oh, no.
So this has been great, and do keep in contact with us.
Okay, sure will.
Because we will, I'm sure, utilize you somehow. So,
okay.
But this has been a great interview, and it's been wonderful hearing your stories over your military career, which spanned, 30 years?
Yeah, essentially that, not quite, but
yeah,
essentially that.
Basically 30 years. So, again, thank you for coming, and we're gonna have these on DVD soon, I hope, and we'll sure get you a copy for your children.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gene.
I don't-